So what exactly is Sea Monsters, and how good is the deck in the current meta? Hey guys, it's Brother here, and welcome back to another episode of LoR Explained, a series where I break down Legends of Runeterra decks. Today, we're going to be looking at a deck that I initially had doubts about coming into patch 1.2 called Sea Monsters. And the main reason why I had doubts about the success of the deck in this patch was because I wasn't quite sure how the deck was going to perform without Burn Aggro running around in the format anymore. But, as it turns out, the deck is pretty much performing just as good as it was before, if not better. Now, the deck list I'm using today is from the Mobaltics Meta Tier List, and if you want to see it for yourself, I'll be providing the deck list and the code in the description below. Alright, so Sea Monsters is a deck that is almost exclusively made up of cards from Rising Tides, and for those of you who don't know, or just need a quick refresher, Deep was one of the featured mechanics of Rising Tides. It just says, once you have 15 or fewer cards in your deck, your creature gets +3/+3. And the goal of our deck is to get to Deep as quickly as possible so that we can smash our opponent in the face with humongous sea creatures. So with that goal in mind, let's get straight to the cards, starting off with our Payoffs. In this deck, we have 3 champions. We have 3 copies of Nautilus, 2 copies of Maokai, and finally a single copy of Thresh. So first off, Nautilus is kind of like the face of the deck and pretty much has everything we want in a beefy creature. For 7 mana, we get a 0/12 creature with Tough and Fearsome. And at first, this doesn't really seem like a lot, and that's because, like many of our Payoffs, the exciting part of Nautilus comes from achieving Deep. Once we're able to toss enough cards from our deck to achieve Deep, 3 things happen in Nautilus. First, he brings back every single tossed ally that costs 4 or more back into our deck. This is great because it guarantees that we're going to be able to draw into our threats no matter what. Now, don't worry, I know you might be wondering, wait, if we're adding cards back into our deck, isn't that kind of redundant because we want to be deep? Well, that's a great question. Well, if we look back into the text, Deep says, I have +3/+3 once your deck has had 15 or fewer cards left. What this means is that we don't always have to have 15 or less cards to stay in Deep. We just need to get there once. So Nautilus adding extra cards wouldn't ever put us out of Deep. Secondly, once we level up Nautilus, he makes every single sea monster cost 4 less mana. This makes it so that we can play multiple threats for cheap in one turn. And finally, if that isn't enough, Nautilus just becomes a whopping 13/13 with Tough and Fearless. Overall, Nautilus is a great payoff for going deep and is very resistant to damage-based removal. The only real downside of Nautilus right now is probably that he's not very good against Will of Ionia. Otherwise, if he's able to stick on the board, it's pretty much over for your opponent. Next up, we have Maokai. The first thing you might notice about Maokai is that he doesn't have the insane stats that Nautilus has. But that's not a problem because Maokai adds a lot of other benefits to the deck. First, he helps the deck get deep really fast, tossing 2 cards every time you play a creature. On top of that, he also creates a sampling, which is great for picking off smaller creatures and synergizes well with his level up condition. However, a big reason why Maokai is great in Sea Monsters is because he adds an alternative win condition to the deck by milling out your opponent once he levels up. He leaves your opponent with 4 non-champion cards in their deck, so unless your opponent was extremely ahead, Maokai is really good at pushing your opponent out of the game. It's also nice that we get a sampling at the beginning of every round, as it helps us get rid of pesky blockers and force through damage with our big creatures. Finally, we have a single copy of Thresh. Now, some Sea Monster deck lists might not actually include Thresh, but in my opinion, he's a great inclusion. Thresh is a great blocker during the mid game, and with 3 power, can challenge relevant champions such as Ezreal, Heimerdinger, and Karma. His passive isn't too hard to achieve, especially when you have Maokai on the board creating saplings for you. The best part of Thresh is that once you level him up, he's able to instantly bring out a champion from your deck to attack with him. The dream scenario here, if you didn't already guess, is to attack with Thresh and to bring out a 13/13 Fearsome Nautilus. And speaking from experience, this is not fun to see from the receiving end. So with the champions out of the way, let's quickly talk about the big baddies of the deck, our Sea Monsters. Our first unit at 3 mana, we have Jaw Hunters. Now obviously, Jaw Hunters isn't exactly a sea monster, but we'll guarantee that we get one. We don't want a big sea monster in our hand early on in the game anyway, so Jaw Hunter can actually be pretty nuts. Since for 3 mana, it essentially kills almost any threat in the early game, and also replaces itself with a card. The only downside is that it has 1 health, so it can get picked off by spells like Static Shock and Vile Feast, but if there's anything we learned from Grizzled Ranger, I think that the upside of the card is well worth the downside of 1 health. Moving on, there's not much to say about Abyssal Eye, except that it's a great value creature. Without Deep, Abyssal Eye is a 3/3 elusive creature that draws you cards and helps you get to Deep faster. With Deep, it just becomes a 6/6 elusive creature that draws you cards and can end the game fast unless your opponent has an elusive creature of their own. Next up, we have Devourer of the Deep. This unit is one of the craziest payoffs in our deck, since it's not only a big beater, but a removal spell as well. Devourer of the Deep obliterates any enemy unit with less health than itself and can kill almost every troubling champion in the game. Also, keep in mind that Obliterate is great because it negates last breath effects and gets past Unyielding Spirit. The only downside to Devour of the Deep is that your opponent can respond and negate its play effect by damaging Devourer's health, so it's a good rule of thumb to evaluate what your opponent might have first before choosing to play Devourer right away. The The next creature in our deck is Terror of the Tides, and this card makes combat incredibly hard for our opponent. It gives all of our sea monsters fearsome, while giving all of our opponent's units -2/-0. This makes it impossible for our opponents to trade into our creatures, let alone block them, since the -2/-0 effect might force their creatures to go below 3 damage, making them unable to block our fearsome sea monsters. And finally, we have our biggest creature, Hapless Aristocrat. Just kidding. Hapless Aristocrat isn't really a payoff, I just thought I'd mention it now before I move on to the next part of the deck. This card has a small benefit of synergizing with Thresh and Maokai and helping them level up, but in the end it's not really essential to our strategy, it's just here as a filler 1-drop. Okay, so right now we know that our deck has a crazy amount of payoffs for going deep, but to consistently get deep, we're going to want to include a lot of toss cards. So in our Sea Monsters deck, we have 3 creatures that toss cards and help us get deep, while also being great blockers in the early game. The first creature is Dreg Dredgers, an awesome turn 1 play that tosses 3 cards. Thorny Toad's just a 1/4 unit that tosses 2 cards and gains us 2 life when it dies. It's great against aggressive decks and can usually block at least twice before it dies. And finally, Dead Bloom Wanderer is a 3/2 lifesteal unit that tosses 3 when you play it. A 3/2 lifesteal stat line is actually really relevant since Dead Bloom Wanderer keeps us alive while also being able to block fearsome units. In terms of spells, we have 2 burst spells that are really efficient and crucial for getting deep. The first of which is Jettison. Jettison is just a very efficient card in our deck as it tosses 4 cards for only 1 mana. The only thing I'd want to keep in mind when playing Jettison is that it might be useful to keep Jettison in hand as a way to bait your opponent into a bad attack. A really basic example would be, let's say you're 3 away from deep and your opponent is attacking you with a 5/5 enraged Yeti, and all you have is a 4/4 Devourer of the Deep. In this scenario, having a Jettison in hand would be awesome, because if you're able to burst cast it, you toss 4 cards so that you become deep, and then you turn your Devourer into a 7/7, resulting in a favorable trade for you. The second toss spell in our deck is Salvage. For 4 mana, Salvage tosses 2 cards and draws us 2. It's just a great way to draw us into more threats, and of course helps us get 4 closer to deep. Okay, so that's pretty much all of our toss effects. To round off the rest of our deck, we just have a few more spells to help us control the board while we're trying to get deep. Vile Feast helps pick off 1 health creatures and provides us with a 1/1 chump blocker. It's also great at dealing with barriers, which is nice. Grasp the Undying snipes a lot of crucial 3 health champions and also helps keep us alive. Withering Wail, great board wipe against aggro strategies, and Atrocity just adds an extra win condition to the deck and allows us to deal direct damage to our opponent outside of combat. Also, just keep in mind that Atrocity is great at responding to cards like Will of Ionia and Vengeance, so just something to keep in mind. And finally, Miscall just adds a lot of flexibility to the deck, and is useful during all stages of the game. Played early, it can bring back like a Thorny Toad or a Dead Bloom Wanderer, and helps us toss more. Played late, it helps us bring back a giant sea monster that was killed in combat or through removal spells. So to sum it up, Sea Monsters wants to toss a bunch of cards early in order to get to deep as quickly as possible. Once we're deep, our deck pretty much runs on autopilot and we just slam big beefy threats and smash our opponents in the face. Overall, Sea Monsters is a very strong deck, and it's also a very fun deck to play. It's the only deck in Legends of Runeterra that slams big creatures on the board, so if that's something that interests you, definitely consider picking up Sea Monsters. Anyways, against aggro decks, Sea Monsters is usually favored against aggro decks. The deck has a lot of ways to deal with the pressure, so you want to be mulliganing for cards like Dead Bloom Wanderer and Whispering Wail. Against midrange decks like midrange Bannerman or midrange Shen, it just depends on who's able to build their board first. In these matchups, Devourer of the Depths is going to do a lot of work since it gets past barrier effects and it can 2-for-1 your opponent most of the time. Finally, Deep kind of struggles with some control decks because of Will of Ionia. With that said, it still has a solid chance of winning games, but you just have to focus on applying enough pressure during the mid game. You want to develop Deep as fast as you can, especially before they can get their value engine online. Since their win condition can usually get past your big monsters, you want to focus on killing their crucial champions like Ezreal and Karma. Alright, so that about wraps up my guide for Sea Monsters in Legends of Runeterra. I know that there's a variety of builds for this deck out there that included cards like the Ruination and stuff, so if you have a deck list that you want to share, just let me know in the comments below. Also, don't forget to let me know which deck you'd like me to cover next. As always, if you like the video, please feel free to leave a like. It lets me know that you're enjoying the content. And if you want to see more Legends of Runeterra Explained, click on that subscribe button and consider tapping that bell icon to get alerts every time I post a video. Till next time, peace.